The sea came up the cliff like something with a grievance, and Dagobert of Rouseworthy stood at the very lip of the rock and let it try for him. Rain drove sideways off the water in ropes that stung the skin. The wind hauled at his great coat until the wool cracked like a sail, and below him, where the cove narrowed to a throat of black stone, the whole grey Atlantic flung itself in and drew back and flung itself again, roaring as though it meant to pull the land down after it. He had watched 100 such storms from this exact place. He had come to them the way another man might come to church, for the same reason and with the same silence, because up here there was no one to speak to him and nothing to answer, and the noise of the water was larger than the noise inside his own chest. For an hour or two drowned it. Then the lightning opened the sky, and he saw the ship. She was already dying. A coasting brig, small, over-canvassed by some fool who had run too near the shore trying to make harbour before the weather closed, and the weather had not permitted it. She lay over on her side in the trough with her mainmast gone by the board, and a raffle of rigging trailing off her like torn hair, and the seas were breaking clean across her, white and heavy, and each one that broke took a little more of her away. Dagobert did not move. There was nothing a man could do from the top of a cliff for a ship on the rocks except watch her go, and he had watched things go before. He had learned that lesson thoroughly and at a price he did not care to name, but he watched. The brig struck. He felt it more than heard it, a shudder that came up through the rock into the soles of his boots, and then the sea simply folded her under and she was gone, mast and hull and whatever souls had trusted themselves to her, gone between one wave and the next as though she had never been floated. The water closed. The storm did not so much as pause to mark it, and Dagobert stood a long moment with the rain running off the brim of his hat and down his jaw, and something old and buried turned over in him, heavy and cold, and he thought as he always thought, the sea keeps what it takes. He was turning to go when he saw the pale thing in the surf. At first he took it for a spar, or a bolt of canvas washed loose, some debris of the wreck that the waves were working shoreward along the shingle at the cove's mouth. It rolled in the wash and rolled out again, and the undertow dragged it back, and the next comber shoved it further up the strand, and in the flicker of the next lightning he saw that it was not canvas at all. It was a person. It was a woman, or had been one. She lay face down in the streaming shingle with her arms flung out and her skirts, sodden black, wrapped and twisted about her legs, and the sea was using her the way it used everything else it had drowned, without malice and without mercy, shoving her up and hauling her back. And she did not fight it, because a body that has given up fighting looks exactly like that. Dagobert was already moving. He did not decide to. Later, when he had leisure to be ashamed of how little decision there had been, he would understand that his legs had carried him to the cliff path before his mind had formed a single word, and that he had gone down that path, a goat track of wet rock and rooted heather that he would not have trusted in daylight sober, at a plunging, sliding run. One hand raking the stone, the storm shoving at his back as though it too wanted him in the water. Twice his boots went from under him, twice he caught himself. The cove came up to meet him, black and roaring, and the spray hit him full in the face at the bottom, salt and cold enough to stop the breath, and then he was on the shingle, and the shingle was moving under the retreating wave like a live thing, and the woman was 10 yards off, and the sea was reaching for her again. He did not stop to gauge the water. He went into it to the knees, to the thighs. It dragged at him, tried to take his footing, tried to make him one more thing it had, and he set his jaw and leaned into it and got a fist in the sodden mass of her skirts, and then his arm under her, and then, hauling both arms, and turned his back on the sea and carried her up out of it, while the next woke against him waist high and did its best to claim them both. It did not manage. He was a large man and an angry one, and the anger just then was all for the water. He staggered up the shingle beyond the tide line and went down on one knee in the coarse wet stones and laid her there and looked at what he had brought out. She was young. That was the first thing, and it went into him like a splinter, because the drowned should not be young. The sea had no business with faces like this one. She was perhaps 22, no more, with dark hair pasted flat to a white brow and a mouth gone blue at the edges, and her lashes lay wet and still against her cheek, and she did not move, and she did not breathe. Her gown had been good once, a widow's gown, he saw, plain black stuff. well made, and it was ruined now, the hem torn to rags, one sleeve half wrenched away, the sodden fabric molded to her, and beneath it, where his hand had gone to lift her, he had felt with a jolt that stopped his own breath the unmistakable swell of a woman gone some months with child. For an instant Dagobert of Roseworthy knelt in the surf roar, and did not move at all, and the whole of his ruined history rose up in him in one grey wave and told him that he was too late, that he was always too late. That the sea kept what it took, and this was one more thing it had taken, and he had merely fished the husk of it out of the water to torment himself. Then he shoved the history down where it lived, and he turned her onto her side, and he struck her once, hard, between the shoulder blades with the flat of his hand. Nothing, he struck her again. The wind screamed. He got her up over his knee, her head hanging, and drove the heel of his hand up under her ribs the way the fishermen of the cove did it, once, twice, roughly, with no gentleness left in him, because gentleness was a thing for the living, and on the third stroke she convulsed, and the sea came out of her. It came in a rush, water and worse. Gout after gout of it, and she heaved and choked and heaved again, and then, God be thanked, she dragged a breath, a terrible whooping tearing breath, and coughed and breathed, and hands came up clawing at the shingle at nothing, at him, and closed on the wet lapel of his coat and held. There, he said. His own voice startled him. He had not heard it in some days, and it came out of him cracked and low and strange, half lost in the wind. There, you are ashore. You are ashore, breathe. Her eyes opened. They were dark and enormous and full of the drowning still, and they found his face bent over hers and fixed on it with the blind, total attention of someone for whom this one face has become the entire boundary of the world. She could not speak. Her lips shaped something, some word, and no sound came but the rasp of her breathing, and her hand tightened on his coat as though she thought he might yet be a thing the water was showing her before it took her back. You will not go back in, he told her, as if she had asked it aloud, and heard the roughness in his own promise. Not while I stand. Do you hear me? Not while I stand, she heard him. Something in the dark drowned eyes steadied minutely, at the sound of a human voice making a human promise, and her lashes fell, and she shuddered head to foot with a cold that was killing her more slowly than the water would have, but killing her nonetheless. And Dagobert became aware, all at once, of the whole ferocious ordinary difficulty of what he had done. He had a living woman on his hands, half drowned, chilled past shivering soon, and with child, at the foot of a cliff in the worst blow of the autumn, a half-mile of goat track and wet moor between her and any fire, and the light entirely gone, and no one within call, because he had made very certain these 3 years that there was never anyone within call. He got his greatcoat off. The wind tried to take it, and he swore at it, and won. And he wrapped the sodden shivering length of her in the heavy wool, tucking it close about the swell of her that had stopped his heart. And he got one arm under her knees, and one behind her shoulders, and stood, and she weighed nothing. She weighed like a drowned bird. And that frightened him more than the sea had. Hold to me, he said against her wet hair. If you can hear me at all, hold. Her hand inside the folds of the coat crept up and closed weakly on his collar. She held. The path up was worse than the path down had been, because now he could not use his hands, and the storm had marked him for its own and meant to have him. He went up it a yard at a time, testing each foothold, the rain a solid moving wall against his face, the woman's dead weight dragging at his shoulders, and her breath, when he could feel it all against his throat, coming shallow and too slow. Twice the track crumbled under his boot, and he stood swaying over the drop with the sea grinning white below, and got his weight back by main force. He did not let himself think of the drop. He thought of the fire in the great hall that Mrs. Pell would have banked for the night. He thought of the distance to it, foot by foot. He thought of nothing else, because thinking of anything else, of a smaller weight, 3 years gone, that he had also carried up a cliff too late, would have finished him, and he could not afford to be finished, because this one was still breathing. Stay, he said to her when her breath hitched and stopped and he had to shift her weight and jog her hard to start it again. Stay, I have not carried you off the rocks to have you die on the heath like a fool. Breathe, madam. Breathe, curse you, breathe. She breathed. The top of the cliff, when he gained it, was almost worse, for up here there was nothing to break the wind at all, and it came off the sea unhindered across the open moor and hit him square and staggered him 3 steps sideways. But he had the lie of his own land in his bones. He could have walked it blind, and he very nearly did, head down, shoulders set, carrying his impossible burden through the streaming heather toward the one point of light in the whole black drowning world, a single lit window, small and gold and steady. High up in the grey bulk of the house that crouched on the headland with its back to the storm like an old dog that has learned to sleep through anything. Rousworthy, his house, his cliffs, his cove, his sea, his silence. He had shut himself inside all of it 3 years ago and told the world to keep out, and the world, which feared him and was glad enough to oblige, had kept out. And now he was carrying the sea's own castaway up to his door, a nameless drowned widow with another life folded living inside her. And he did not know her name, and she did not know his, and he did not know, bent into the wind, his arms shaking, small gold window swimming nearer through the rain, that he was carrying the whole future of his house up the hill in a torn black gown, and that nothing in it would ever again be as silent or as empty or as safe from feeling as it had been an hour before. He reached the door. He turned his shoulder to it and beat on the oak with the flat of his boot 3 heavy blows that boomed through the house, and lifted his voice over the storm in a shout that had not left him in longer than he could remember. Pell, Mrs. Pell. Bring light, bring the fire up. I have a living soul here and I mean to keep her living. Open the door. The door was hauled open and the warmth of the house fell out into the storm, and with it came Mrs. Pell in her nightcap and shawl, a candle streaming in her hand, and her lined face going from sleep to alarm to a stern, practical dread in the space of a breath. She was the last of the old household who had stayed when the rest had gone, or been sent, and she had seen her master carry a burden through a storm before, and the memory of it stood plainly in her eyes now, and she did not speak it, and Dagobert loved her, in the buried way he loved anything, for not speaking it. She was on the brig, he said, shouldering past her into the hall, the woman streaming across his arms. It broke up on the skerry. She is the only soul that came ashore that I could see. She is half drowned and chilled through, and she is... He stopped. The word was absurd in his mouth. She is with child, some months, wake nobody else. Build the fire in the blue room and heat what stones you have and find dry linen. And be quick, Mrs. Pell, be very quick, for she stops breathing when she is let alone. Mrs. Pell did not waste breath on questions. She was already moving, the candle bobbing ahead of her up the wide dark stair, throwing their 2 shadows huge and reeling against the panelling, and Dagobert came behind with his impossible burden and his boots leaving black wet prints on stone that had not felt hurry in 3 years. The house woke around them in the way of old houses, grudgingly, a creak here and a draught there, and the storm beat on the seaward windows as though affronted to be shut out. He carried her into the blue room, a chamber that had been shut and dust-sheeted so long that the very air in it was cold as a cellar, and laid her on the bed, while Mrs. Pell tore the sheets from the furniture and knelt at the grate and coaxed a flame out of the laid fire with hands that shook only a little. In the growing light the woman looked worse than she had on the shingle. Her face had the greyish pallor of the very cold, and her lips were bloodless, and her breath came in that same shallow rasp that stopped and had to be startled into starting. Dagobert stood over her with the water running off him and did not know, suddenly, what a man did with his hands at such a time. He had brought her up the cliff by main strength. Strength was no more used to her now. "You are in the way, sir," said Mrs. Pell, not unkindly, rising from the fire. "Begging your pardon. Go and get the wet off you before you take a chill yourself and leave me 2 of you to nurse. I will have her out of these ruined things and warm in 10 minutes, and I will send for you the moment she can hear you. Go on." He went, because it was sense, and because he could not have said what he wanted to stay for. He changed in his own cold room by feel, dragging on dry linen and a coat, and he stood a moment at his black streaming window looking down toward the cove he could no longer see, where a ship and her people had gone under an hour since as though they had never lived, and he thought of the one life the sea had let go of, and he found that his hands were not quite steady, and he was angry at them for it, and he could not make them stop. When Mrs. Pell's soft knock came, he was across the house before the sound had died. They had her in the bed proper now, banked round with hot stones wrapped in flannel, her dark hair loose and drying on the pillow, her face turned toward the fire. Someone, Mrs. Pell, had found a plain nightgown and got her into it, and had washed the salt and the shingle off her, and without the ruin of the drowned gown she looked younger still, and the swell of her beneath the coverlet was gently, undeniably plain. And Dagobert looked at it once and looked away and felt the old grey wave lift in him again and put it down. She has not truly waked, Mrs. Pell murmured. She stirs and speaks a word or two and goes off again. Her breathing is easier since she warmed. But, sir, the old woman hesitated and lowered her voice further, and there was something almost like hope struggling in her tired face, something he had not seen there in 3 years. The child stirs. I felt it. Whatever the sea did to the mother, the little one within is fighting yet. If we can keep the fever off her, I think we may keep them both. Both. The word went through Dagobert oddly. He did not sit. He stood at the foot of the bed with his hands behind his back like a man on parade, keeping the distance that was his habit and his armor, and he watched the woman breathe. And after a while her lips moved and a sound came out of her, low and cracked, and he leaned in despite himself to catch it. The boat, she was saying, to no one, her closed eyes moving beneath the lids. Get her into the boat. The water, it is coming in, it is coming in. No, no, do not let go, do not. Her hand came up off the coverlet and closed on nothing, clutching. And her face twisted with a grief that had nothing to do with the cold, and Dagobert, without deciding to, reached down and took the clutching hand in his. It was the first time in 3 years he had willingly taken hold of another living person, and the strangeness of it stopped him where he stood. Her fingers were cold and small, and they closed on his with a drowning creature's blind strength, exactly as they had on the shingle, and the grief in her face eased by a fraction, and she stilled. You are ashore, he said, low, the same words, because they were the only true and useful thing he had. The water cannot reach you here. You are ashore, and you are warm, and you are not alone. Rest. She did not wake, but her breathing lengthened and deepened, and her grip on his hand did not loosen, and Dagobert of Roseworthy, who had built 3 years of silence to keep exactly this from happening, found himself drawing the chair to the bedside with his free hand and sitting down in it, because she was holding on to him, and he discovered that he could not make himself pull free. He sat the night out. Mrs. Pell dozed by the fire and rose to change the stones and dose the woman, when she surfaced, with warmed wine and honey, and between them, through the long roaring dark, they kept the fever back and the breath going. Toward the grey of the morning the storm blew itself out. The wind dropped from a scream to a mutter and then to nothing, and the terrible noise of the sea sank to the ordinary heavy breathing of the swell against the rocks, and into the sudden quiet a thin cold daylight came up over the moor. And the woman in the bed opened her eyes, and this time kept them open. Dagobert had not slept. He was still in the chair, her hand still in his. He had not been able to reason himself out of it in the small hours, and he saw the moment the drowning left her eyes and thought came back into them. And he saw her look first at the strange ceiling, and then at the fire, and then, slowly with a dawning fear that made him ashamed of his own grim face, at him. He let go of her hand at once and sat back. You are safe, he said. It came out too harshly, his voice always did. He had forgotten how to make it do anything else. You were wrecked, on the skerry at the mouth of the cove below. I brought you up. You are in a house on the headland. No one here will harm you. She stared at him. Her lips parted. When her voice came it was a thread, ruined by the salt, barely there. The others, she whispered. There was a woman, and her children, and the master, and the men. Did any? She read the answer in his stillness before he gave it, and Dagobert watched the hope go out of her, and it was a thing he would have spared her if there had been any way, and there was none. You were the only soul the sea gave back, he said. I am sorry, I looked. There was no other. For a long moment she did not move at all. Then her face crumpled, not loudly, not in any way that asked anything of him, but silently. The tears simply welling and spilling and running down into the loose dark hair, and she turned her face away toward the fire and wept without a sound, the way a person weeps who has learned that grief embarrasses the world and must be done quietly and alone. And Dagobert, who knew that particular silent weeping better than he knew any prayer, because he had done a great deal of it himself in this house with the doors shut, sat very still and did not offer her the empty comfortable lies, and did not leave, and after a while, without a word, he simply put his hand back over hers on the coverlet, and left it there and let her weep against the strength of it. When at last she was quiet, spent, her eyes closed and swollen, she spoke again, still turned away. "You pulled me out of the water," she said. "I felt it. I thought I had died, and then there were arms and a voice, telling me I should not go back in." A shudder went through her. "I do not know your name, sir, to thank you." Dagobert opened his mouth to give it, and did not. He did not, and he could not afterward have told anyone why, except that his name was a heavy and a public thing, a name that came with a title and a history, and a wall of fear and whispered story that men and women alike put up around him the moment they heard it. And that this drowned young widow was looking at him not with fear, not with awe, but only with the raw, naked gratitude of one creature to another that had kept it alive, and he did not want, just yet, to watch that turn into the other thing. He did not want to be the Duke of Rouseworthy in this room, this morning. He wanted, God help him, to be only the man with the arms and the voice. "They call me Dagobert," he said. It was true. It was simply not the whole of the truth. "It is my house. You will stay in it until you are well, and until," his eyes went, once to the swell beneath the coverlet and away, "until you are more than well. There is no argument to be had about it, so do not make one. What are you called?" The ghost of something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her ruined mouth at his brusqueness, and it did something to him that he did not examine. "Jonquil," she whispered. "Jonquil Ingleby. My husband was Thomas Ingleby of Whitby. He died in the spring. I was going to my aunt at Falmouth, because there was nowhere else, because the child—" Her hand moved under his, to lie flat and protective over the swell, and her voice broke and steadied. "Because the child is coming and I had no one. And now I have less than no one, and I do not even know whose roof I am under, or how I shall ever repay the keeping of it." "You will repay nothing," said Dagobert, and rose, because the conversation had come too close to something, and he needed the distance of his feet. "You will rest, and you will eat what Mrs. Pell brings you, and you will let the child grow, and that will be repayment enough for any Christian house. Sleep, Mrs. Ingleby. The storm is over. Nothing more will come at you out of the sea." He went to the door. Her voice followed him, low and rough and entirely without guile. "Dagobert," she said, as though trying the strange name over, testing whether it was safe. "Thank you for not letting go." He stood a moment with his hand on the latch and his back to her, and something in the plain dark house shifted on its foundation, some door long swollen shut in him giving a fraction, letting in a thread of cold clean air, and he did not turn around, because he did not trust his own face. "Sleep," he said again roughly, and went out and shut the door, and stood in the cold corridor a long while with his eyes closed, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another heart beating under his roof, and telling himself, without the smallest success, that it changed nothing at all. She slept the better part of 2 days, and Dagobert, who had told himself it changed nothing, found that his feet carried him to the door of the blue room a dozen times between one dawn and the next. He did not go in. He stood in the corridor and listened. Or he asked Mrs. Pell in the low, toneless way that fooled neither of them how the patient did, and Mrs. Pell told him the fever had come a little on the second night, and had broken by the third morning. The cough was loosening. The child stirred strong. The young widow ate what was put before her, and thanked everyone too much, and wept still when she thought no one heard her. And Dagobert took each report away with him, and turned it over in the empty rooms of the house, and could not have said why the loosening of a stranger's cough should sit in his chest like something he had won. He knew, of course. He was a hard man and a closed one, but he was not a stupid one, and he knew perfectly well what was happening to him, and he distrusted it entirely. He had felt the world's warmth before. He knew what it cost when it was taken away. 3 years ago this house had held a wife, and for 11 days a son, and the sea and the childbed fever between them had emptied it, his Cassandra and the boy both gone in one wet spring within a fortnight of each other, and Dagobert had closed the doors of Rouseworthy on the whole of humankind, and taught himself that a man who loved nothing could lose nothing. And it had been, on the whole, true, and the truth of it had kept him alive in the way that a splint keeps a broken thing from moving. And now a drowned woman with another man's child folded living inside her had reached up out of the surf and caught the splint in her cold small hand, and he could feel the old break in him aching to knit crooked around her, and it terrified him more than the cliff path had. So he was brusque with her, when at last she was well enough to leave the blue room and come, wrapped in a shawl of Mrs. Pell's, to sit by the fire in the small parlour that was the only warm room he kept. He was brusque and short, and he answered her gentle questions in as few words as he could manage, and he watched, grimly, to see the fear come into her face that came into everyone's face sooner or later at Rouseworthy, and it did not come. That was the thing he had not accounted for. Jonquil Ingleby was not afraid of him. She ought to have been. He was a large, forbidding man with a face like weather, and a manner like a shut gate, and she was alone and destitute and utterly in his power, and any sensible young woman in her position would have crept about the edges of his temper and flinched at his silences. She did not. She was quiet, and she was courteous, and she was plainly still carrying a grief that pulled her under without warning 2 or 3 times a day, but she looked at him when he was short with her, with a kind of calm, dark attention, as though she were listening past the roughness to something underneath it. And once, when he had answered some kindness of hers with a grunt and turned to the window, she said quite mildly to his back, "You are not nearly so disagreeable as you work at being, you know. I have been watching." A truly disagreeable man does not sit up 3 nights with a stranger's hand in his, or send up beef broth twice a day to a woman he wishes gone. Dagobert turned from the window and stared at her. No one had spoken to him so in 3 years. No one had dared. He waited for himself to be angry and discovered, with something close to alarm, that he was not, that instead a muscle wanted to move at the corner of his mouth that had forgotten how, and he mastered it and said coldly, "Mrs. Pell sends up the broth." "On your order," said Jonquil, and bent her head over the mending she had insisted on being given, because she would not, she said, sit and be waited on like a lady when she was neither a lady nor able to do anything else of use. I asked her, "You may be as gruff as you please, Dagobert. I have decided not to believe it." And she threaded her needle and set a small neat stitch and did not look up, and Dagobert stood by the window with the grey sea behind him and did not know, for the first time in a very long while, what to do with his own face. He took to sitting with her in the evenings. He told himself it was duty. A guest under his roof could not be left to sit alone by the fire the whole of a long autumn evening. It was common decency. It meant nothing. And then the evenings arranged themselves without his deciding anything. And he found that he had begun to look toward the end of the day the way a man looks toward the end of a hard road, because at the end of it there was the small warm parlour and the fire and Jonquil Ingleby in the chair opposite with her mending or her book, and the strange, unfamiliar, almost unbearable sensation of not being alone in a way that did not hurt. They talked a little and then more. She told him of Whitby, of the grey harbour and the herring boats, and the house over the chandler's shop where she had been a girl, of Thomas Ingleby, who had been a good man and a gentle one and much older than she, a mate on the coasting ships, who had married her out of a hard place and been kind to her in it for 4 years, and then been carried off in a spring fever with the child, not yet 3 months begun. She told it plainly, without self-pity, and Dagobert listened and did not offer comfort, because he had learned that comfort offered to fresh grief is an insult, and Jonquil seemed to understand that his silence was not indifference, but the opposite of it, and told him more. He told her almost nothing, but he found himself telling her a little, which for him was a flood. He told her the names of the headlands and the trick of the tides in the cove. He told her which of the more birds could be heard at which season, once, unwarily watching the fire. He told her that the house had been very full once and was not now, and she did not press him. She only went still and let the words sit in the room, and then said, softly, "Yes, I thought it must have been. A house holds the shape of what has left it. This one is full of that shape." And Dagobert had got up and gone to bank the fire so that she would not see his face, and had come back and sat down and said, after a while, "Roughleif, and our son, 3 years since. The fever, and the sea took something else that was mine. The same spring. And that was all, and it was more than he had said aloud to any living soul in 3 years, and Jonquil had reached across the small distance between the chairs and laid her hand over his where it gripped the arm once, briefly, and taken it away again before he could decide whether to allow it, and they had sat in the firelight in a silence that had, for the first time, no ache in it. The weeks went by like that, and the autumn deepened, and the sea beat the cliffs and the moor went brown and gold and then bare, and the child in Jonquil grew, and Dagobert of Rousworthy came slowly and against his whole will back to life. He noticed it in small treacherous things. He noticed that the house was warmer, that fires were laid in rooms that had been shut, that Mrs. Pell hummed at her work and the two girls that came up from the village to help had stopped creeping and started laughing in the scullery. He noticed that he shaved with more care. He noticed that he had begun to bring things in from his walks on the moor, a curl of ram's horn, a greenstone from the beck, a late spray of sea holly blue and strange, and to set them, wordlessly, on the parlour table where Jonquil would find them, and that she never once remarked on it, only smiled her slow grave smile, and put the sea holly in a cup of water and the greenstone on the mantel, and that the small unspeaking exchange of these things had become the truest conversation he had had in years. He noticed, above all, that he had begun to be afraid, not of her, but for her. The child would come in the deep of winter, Mrs. Pell reckoned, and Dagobert, who had lost a wife to childbed, could not think of the deep of winter without a cold hand closing on his heart. He said nothing of it. But he sent, quietly, a rider the long 12 miles to the market town, and had the man come back with the best of what could be got, good linen, a cradle of turned oak, the small, strange, soft things a coming child required, of which Dagobert knew nothing and Mrs. Pell knew everything. And when Jonquil found the cradle set by the parlour fire one grey afternoon, she stood over it a long time with her hand pressed to her mouth and her eyes streaming, and Dagobert, caught in the doorway, made to withdraw, and she said, without turning, in a voice full of tears, "Stay, please." No one has ever, and could not finish, and he came into the room and stood beside her and looked down at the empty cradle, and neither of them said anything at all for a long while. "It is a good stout cradle," he said at last, because he had to say something. He stopped. He had been going to say it was made by the same man in the village who had made another one, 3 years since, that had been used 11 days, and then never again. And that he had gone to that same man and ordered this one, and stood in the man's shed with his hat in his hand, while the whole village pretended not to marvel that the Duke of Rousworthy had come out of his silence to order a cradle for a nameless castaway. He did not say it. "It is a good stout cradle," he said again. "It will do. It will do," Jonquil agreed softly and wiped her eyes and looked up at him, and there was something in her face then, in the firelight, over the empty cradle, that was no longer only gratitude, and that Dagobert saw and understood and felt answer in himself with a lurch like the ground going, and that both of them, by unspoken treaty, looked away from, because it's too soon, and she was too newly widowed, and he was too newly alive, and the thing between them was too new and too precious to be seized and perhaps broken by being named. That night, alone in his cold room with the sea muttering below, Dagobert stood at his window a long time and admitted to himself the thing he had been refusing for weeks. He had not told her who he was. She thought him a hard, private, moderately comfortable man, the master of a lonely house, gentleman enough, but of no great consequence, and she was easy with him because of it, easy in a way she would not be with a duke. And he had let the misunderstanding stand and grow because he was a coward, because he could not bear to watch her calm dark eyes fill with the fear and the deference that his title brought. Because for the first time since the world had emptied, he was being seen by someone as a man and not as a great cold name, and he wanted it. He wanted it with an intensity that shamed him, and every day he let it stand it grew into a larger and more dangerous lie. He would have to tell her. He knew it. A thing built on a concealment cannot stand, and he made himself form the word, alone in the dark, and it frightened him. He wanted this to stand. He wanted it to stand for the rest of his life. And so he would have to tell her, and soon, and take the risk of watching the ease go out her, and trust that what had grown between them over the sea holly and the empty cradle was strong enough to survive the weight of who he was. He would tell her, he decided, when the child was safely come and she was strong again. He would not lay one more fear on her now, so near her time. He would keep her and the coming child safe through the winter, and when it was over and she was well, he would stand before her as the Duke of Rousworthy and let her judge him and take his chance. It was, he would come to see, exactly the wrong order to do things in, but he did not know that yet. He knew only that below his window the sea was quiet for once, and that under his roof 2 hearts were beating that had not been beating there in the autumn, and that he, who had sworn to love nothing so as to lose nothing, had gone and done the forbidden thing after all, and could not for his life bring himself to be sorry. There was a night, in the deepest part of that autumn, before the world had found them out, when the weather came in off the sea worse than it had come since the night of the wreck. Dagobert had felt it building all the grey afternoon, the glass falling and the birds gone quiet and the swell getting up long and slow and oily against the rocks, and by dark it had broken in earnest, and the old house set its shoulder to it and groaned. He had gone up, as was his habit, to see the seaward shutters made fast, and coming down again along the upper corridor he heard, through the door of the blue room, a sound that stopped him, jonquil, not crying out, but breathing in the quick, shallow way of someone in the grip of a fear too large to master, and murmuring, low, the broken half-words of a person back inside a nightmare she cannot wake from. He should have called Mrs. Pell. He knew even as he lifted his hand to the door that a duke did not go alone by night into the room of an unmarried woman, that it was improper past defending, that the whole careful respectability he was building around her could be undone by a servant's glimpse of it. He knocked low, and when there was no answer but that frightened breathing, he opened the door anyway, because propriety was a small cold thing set against the sound of her fear. She was sitting up in the dark with the storm shaking the shutters, her arms wrapped about herself and the swell of the child, her eyes open, but seeing something that was not the room, the water. He understood, the water coming in, the boat, the letting go, and she was shivering not with cold but with the memory, and when the lightning lit the window white she flinched as though it had struck her. Jonquil, he said low from the doorway, so as not to frighten her worse. It is only weather. You are ashore, you remember. You are in the blue room and it is only weather, and it cannot reach you. Her head turned. For a moment she did not know him, and then she did, and something in her face broke, and she said, in a small unguarded voice with all the composure stripped off it, it sounds the same. It sounds exactly the same as the night the ship. I keep thinking I am back in the water. I am sorry. I am being a great coward. It is only a storm. I know it is only a storm. You are not a coward, said Dagobert. He came into the room and drew the chair to the bedside, the same chair he had sat in the first nights, keeping her breathing, and he sat down in it, deliberately, so that she should see he did not mean to loom over her or to leave. You went under the sea and it did not keep you. A person does not walk away from that and hear a storm the way other people hear it. I know something of it myself. He was quiet a moment, and the wind screamed, and he made himself go on, because he had learned that his own confessions were the only coin that steadied her. I told you the sea took something of mine, the same spring the fever took my wife and boy. I will tell you the whole of it, if it will make the storm smaller for you to know you are not the only one who lies awake counting the waves. My son was 11 days old when the fever took my wife, and 11 days old he still was when it began to take him too, and I could not, there was nothing to be done. The doctor said nothing, and I would not believe it, and I took him down to the town in the boat myself in a blow very like this one, to a second doctor, an hour's hard row across the bay, because I could not sit in the house and do nothing while. His voice stopped and started again lower. The boat took water. We came through it. He did not. He died in my arms in the bottom of the boat halfway across, in the rain, and I rowed the rest of the way with him gone, because I could not make myself turn back, and the second doctor met me on the quay and took one look and said what the first had said. And I rowed him home again through the same storm, and that is what the sea took of mine, jonquil. Not a thing. So when I say the storm cannot reach you here, I am not saying it lightly. I know exactly how far a storm can reach. I have been as far into one as a man can go and come back. And I am telling you that this house and this room, and he stopped, and did not finish the sentence he had not meant to begin, and said instead, roughly, you are past its reach. I will sit here until it blows out if you like. I have sat out worse. She was weeping now. But it was not the frightened weeping of before. It was a softer thing, and it was, he understood, as much for his boy as for her own fear. And she reached out in the dark and found his hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and took it in both of hers and held it against her wet cheek, and said brokenly, "Oh, Dagobert, oh, your little boy. And you sat by me those first nights. You sat in this very chair with my hand in yours after, knowing what a woman near her time can. You did that, with all of that behind you. I never knew. I thought you a hard man who was being kind against his nature. I never knew it cost you your own graveyard to do it. It did not cost me," he said. "That is the thing I've been trying to understand these weeks and have only now, this minute, got the sense of. I thought it would. I braced for it. Every hour I have spent near you, I have braced for the old grief to come up and drown me, because that is what I taught myself it would do. That is why I shut the doors, and it does not come. You would think a woman near her time in the very house where I lost mine would be the worst thing in the world for me to look at, and instead you are the first thing in 3 years I have been glad to look at. I do not understand it. I only know it is true." He turned his hand in hers so that he held her hands instead of her holding his, the great scarred fingers closing warm and sure over her cold ones. "Now, lie back. The storm will blow itself out by morning. They always do. I have made a lifetime study of these storms, and I promise you this one is nothing to the one that brought you. I will sit here. Sleep if you can, and if you cannot, then do not, and we will listen to it together, and it will be a smaller thing for being two." And she lay back against the pillows, but she did not let go of his hand, and he did not take it away. And the storm shook the old house and hurled the sea against the cliffs below, and the two of them kept the watch against it together in the dark, not speaking, her hand in his, and somewhere in the small hours her grip loosened, and her breathing lengthened, and she slept, at last easy, face turned toward him in the faint red light of the banked fire, and Dagobert sat on beside her and looked at her sleeping face until the grey came up in the window and the wind died, and he did not sleep at all, and he did not mind it, and he understood, watching her, that he was never going to be able to let her go to Falmouth or anywhere else, and that the only question left was whether he had the courage to say so. He was gone from the room before Mrs. Pell woke, and the old woman never knew, or was too wise to say she knew. But something had shifted in the house after that night, some last reserve gone out of the space between the Duke and his castaway, and it showed in small things through the shortening days. It showed in the way Jonquil no longer waited to be spoken to but talked to him freely, teasing him out of his black moods with a directness no one had used with him since Cassandra died, so that Mrs. Pell more than once heard the impossible sound of the master's rusty laugh come out through the parlour door, and stood in the passage with her hand to her heart. It showed in the way Dagobert's walks on the moor grew shorter and his evenings by the fire grew longer. It showed in the small offerings that went on appearing on the parlour table, and in the fact that Jonquil had begun, now, to make offerings back. A button sewn more finely on his coat than any valet had ever done it, a book left open at a page she thought he would like, a sprig of the sea holly he brought her pressed and dried and slipped, one morning, into the pocket of his greatcoat where his hand would find it on the cliff, so that he stood on the headland in the wind turning the small blue-dried thing over in his fingers and felt something in his chest that he had genuinely believed was dead in him, and had to stand a while before he trusted his face to go back indoors. It showed, above all, in the village. For Dagobert had begun that autumn to go down into the village, which he had not done in 3 years except to order a cradle, and the reason he went was Jonquil, though he told himself it was a state business. She had asked him one evening gently whether it were true, as Bess had let fall, that there were families in the cove who had lost their men in the same storm that wrecked her ship, other boats, smaller, that had not come in, and Dagobert had said shortly that he supposed it was true, that the storm had been a hard one for the whole coast, and Jonquil had looked at him a long moment and said only, "And their Duke has not been down to see them," not as a reproach quite, but a quiet stating of a fact, and had gone back to her sewing, and Dagobert had sat with it an hour and then got up and put on his coat. He went down the next morning. He did not know going what he meant to do. He had forgotten, in 3 years of silence, how to be anything to his people but a name they feared, But he went to the cottages where the black crape hung, and he stood in low smoky doorways with his hat in his hand. This great forbidding man the village had given up for a kind of ghost, and he said the plain awkward true things, that he was sorry, that the man had been a good fisher and would be missed, that the widow and the children would not want, that he would see to it, that there would be coal for the winter and the rent forgiven and the boys taken on when they were grown, and the village, which had feared him, looked at him standing there stumbling through his condolences with his hat crushed in his hands, and understood. In the way villagers understand everything, that something had happened up at the great house, that the ghost had somehow been made a man again, and they blessed, in their kitchens that night, whatever it was that had done it, and they knew very well what it was. For nothing is secret in a place like that, and the name of the drowned widow the Duke had pulled from the sea was already spoken, in the cove, with a rough proprietary fondness, as though she belonged to all of them. "You have set the whole village talking," Dagobert told her that evening gruffly, standing by the fire with the rain of the raw afternoon still on his shoulders. "I went down as you as good as ordered me to, and I stood in half the doorways in the cove making a great fool of myself. And now they are all of them saying that their hard-hearted Duke has gone soft in the head over a woman off a wreck, and I cannot for the life of me contradict them, because it is entirely true." Jonquil looked up from the cradle she was quietly rocking with one foot, and the firelight was on her face, and she smiled at him the slow grave smile that undid him every time and said, "Then do not contradict them. It is the best-natured piece of gossip the cove has had to chew on in 3 years, and you will not begrudge them it. Come and sit down and be soft in the head where it is warm. You have earned it." And Dagobert came and sat down across from her by the fire. And the child slept between them in the oak cradle, and the rain came against the window, and neither of them said the thing they both now knew, because it was still, by their tender unspoken treaty, too soon. But it sat in the warm room with them plain as the fire, and both of them were content. That night, only to have it there and not yet need to name it, he would tell her who he was within the week. He did not know that yet, sitting by the fire. He thought he had all the winter to choose his moment, all the slow, safe, darkening season to bring her gently to the truth of him, and then, when the child was come and she was strong, to ask her the question that would settle everything. He thought there was time. He was a careful man, and he had planned it carefully, and he did not know that the world was already talking in the town below, that a rider was already being paid to carry word south, that the careful order he had laid out, first safety, then truth, then the question, was about to be torn up entirely by a fussy attorney's letter and a hard old woman's coach and a knot of pains 3 weeks too early. He knew only that he was warm, for the first time in 3 years, all the way through. That a woman he had not gone looking for was sitting across his fire mending his coat and rocking a cradle with her foot, and that whatever it cost him, whatever the county said, whatever his own dead past tried to drag up out of the water to stop him, he was not going to be able to let this go. He had lost the habit of letting things go. He was very glad, sitting there in the firelight, that he had lost it. He did not yet know how soon or how hard that gladness was going to be tried. The world came for them, as the world does, before he was ready. It came first as a letter, carried up the moor by the same rider Dagobert used, and it came from the town, and it was written in the fussy hand of Mr. Pardew, the attorney who managed such of the Roseworthy affairs as could not be neglected even by a man determined to neglect everything. Dagobert read it standing in the cold hall, and his face, which had been softening these weeks past by degrees, set hard again as he read. Word had got about. Of course word had got about. A duke does not send a rider to town for oak cradles and infant linen and Whitby's whereabouts without 100 tongues taking it up. Word had got about that the mad Duke of Roseworthy, the widower who had shut himself on his cliff and would see no one, was keeping a young woman at the great house, a nameless woman, a castaway with no people and no papers, and the attorney set it down with many apologies for the necessity, a woman visibly and scandalously with child. There was talk. There was, Mr. Pardew regretted to say, a great deal of talk, and it had reached the ears of persons whom his Grace might not wish to have it reach, and in particular it had reached the Dowager Lady Wraxall, his Grace's late wife's aunt, who had taken it upon herself, as the nearest thing to family the Duke would acknowledge, to announce her intention of coming to Roseworthy to see for herself what was become of him, and to put a stop, she had been heard to say, to whatever unsuitable business was being conducted there. Dagobert folded the letter very slowly. Lady Wraxall. He knew her of old, a hard, handsome, iron-cornered woman of 60 who had loved Cassandra, and had never forgiven the world, or Dagobert, or the sea for her death, and who had appointed herself the guardian of the Roseworthy name in a family that had otherwise given him up. She would come. She had said she would come, and Lady Wraxall did what she said. She would come, and she would look at Jonquil Ingleby with those cold measuring eyes, and she would see exactly what the world saw. A scheming nobody who had washed up on a lonely rich man's shore and got her hooks in him in his grief. And she would say so, plainly, in that carrying voice, and Jonquil, who did not even know she sat at a duke's table, would learn all of it at once, in the worst possible way, from the cruelest possible mouth. He should have told her weeks ago. He knew it now with a sick certainty. He had meant to spare her, and he had only baited it a trap. He went to find her. She was in the parlour with the low winter sun coming grey through the window and the oak cradle beside her, and she was hemming a small garment with slow, careful stitches. Her whole body settled now into the last heaviness of her time, and she looked up at him and smiled, and then saw his face and set the sewing down. "Something is wrong," she said. Not a question. She had learned to read him. "You have had bad news." "I have had news I should have given you myself, long since," said Dagobert. He stood in the middle of the room, and for once his stillness was not armor, but the paralysis of a man who does not know how to begin. "Jonquil, there is a thing about this house, and about me that you do not know, and that I have let you not know, and I have been a coward and a fool to do it, and now it will come at you from a stranger's mouth unless I say it first. So I will say it." She had gone still, her hands folded on the swell of the child, her dark eyes on him, and the calm in them made it harder, not easier. "Say it, then," she said quietly. He said it. "This house is not merely a comfortable gentleman's house. It is Roseworthy. I am not merely a private man named Dagobert. I am the Duke of Roseworthy. Dagobert is my name, but the rest of it is Duke, and master of this whole coast, and a great deal beyond it. And the woman who is coming here in 3 days' time to look at you and to be cruel to you is my late wife's aunt, a countess's widow, who thinks you an adventuress and means to drive you out. I let you believe I was a small man because," his voice roughened and nearly failed, "because when you looked at me you did not look at a duke, you looked at a man, and I have not been looked at so in 3 years, and I could not give it up. It was selfish, and it was a lie of omission, and I am sorry for it. But I will not have you meet Lady Wraxall not knowing. You had to know first, and from me." The silence in the little room was very complete. The fire ticked, the winter sea breathed against the cliff, and Jonquil Ingleby looked at him for a long moment with an expression he could not read, and then she looked down at her folded hands, and then she gave a small broken sound that he thought at first was a sob and understood, appalled to be a laugh, a helpless, exhausted, entirely mirthless laugh. "A duke," she said. "I have been mending a duke's shirts. I have scolded a duke for being disagreeable and told him I would not believe it. I have sat by a duke's fire in Mrs. Pell's old shawl and let him fetch me sea holly like her." She pressed her hand to her mouth. "Oh, Dagobert. Oh, this is worse than the sea. Do you not see it is worse than the sea?" She looked up, and her eyes were wet and desperate now, all the calm gone out of them. "When I thought you a private man, a lonely man of no great place, I could tell myself there was no harm in it, in sitting with you, in being glad of you, in beginning to—" She stopped, unable, and drove on. There was no harm, because a lonely man might take in a lonely woman, and no one in the world need think anything of it. But a duke does not take in a nameless castaway with another man's child, and no one think anything of it. A duke who does that is a scandal and a byword, and the woman is worse. The woman is I know very well what the woman is called. Your aunt is right to come. Your aunt is right to be cruel. I should have gone to Falmouth the moment I could stand. I should never have let myself be so warm here. I have been ruining you, and I did not even know it, because you would not let me know what you were. You have been saving me," said Dagobert. It came out of him with a violence that startled them both. He crossed the room and went down on one knee by her chair, which he had not planned and could not have prevented, so that his hard-weathered face was level with her wet one. Listen to me. Look at me. Whatever the world calls you and whatever the world calls me for keeping you, I tell you plainly, and I have never in my life said a thing I meant more, you have been saving me. I was dead in this house. I had made myself dead on purpose, so that nothing could touch me again, and it was working. And then the sea threw you up on my shore half drowned, and I carried you up the cliff meaning to do a decent thing and be done, and instead you took hold of my hand and would not let go, and you have been dragging me up out of the water an inch at a time ever since, exactly as I dragged you. And I did not even feel the drowning stop until it had stopped. I do not care what Lady Wraxall calls you. Let her come. Let the whole county come. I have spent 3 years afraid of losing what I love, and I have lost it anyway by refusing to have it, and I am done with being afraid. Do you hear me, Jonquil? I am done. She was weeping openly now, and her hand had come up without either of them willing it, and lay against the side of his hard face, and he turned his head into it, this man who had not been touched in 3 years, and closed his eyes. You must not say such things to me, she whispered. You must not. Is not fair. I am not free to hear them. I am another man's widow, and I carry his child, and I have nothing, no name and no money and no people, and you are the greatest man in the country, and it is impossible. Dagobert, it is impossible, and you are only saying it because I am weak and near my time, and you are kind under all that iron, and you cannot bear to see a thing suffer. That is all it is. That must be all it is. It is not all it is, said Dagobert, and you know it is not, or you would not weep so. He took her hand from his face and held it in both of his, gently, the great scarred hands that had hauled her out of the sea, and he looked at her steadily, and the winter light was on both their faces. But I will not press you now. You are near your time and frightened and grieving still, and I would be a brute to make you answer me now, and I have been many things, but I will try not to be a brute to you, so I ask you nothing. I only tell you the truth so that you have it, and so that no cold old woman can throw it at you as though it were a shameful thing. I love you, there. It is said, and I am not sorry, and I will not unsay it. Now dry your eyes. We have 3 days, and there is a great deal to do. Because when Lady Wraxall comes into this house, she is going to find you not cowering in a back room like a guilty thing, but sitting at my table as my honoured guest, warm and fed and unafraid, and she is going to be made to be civil to you. And if she cannot be civil, she can go back the way she came. That is how it will be. Jonquil looked at him through her tears, and something in her face, some old braced readiness for the world to be cruel and for her to bear it alone, wavered and cracked and began, painfully, to give way to something she plainly did not dare yet to call hope. You are a very stubborn man, she said unsteadily. I am a duke, said Dagobert, with the very faintest twist at the corner of his hard mouth, the first thing near a jest he had made in 3 years. It is generally considered one of my few genuine accomplishments. Now, he rose and drew her up gently by the hand, one arm going without thought to steady the heavy shape of her. Come and eat something, and let Mrs. Pell fuss over you, and stop deciding, all by yourself in that brave sad head of yours, that you must be got rid of for my sake. You are not going to be got rid of. Not to Falmouth, not to your aunt, not to the sea, not anywhere. I have had a very great deal of practice these 3 years at keeping things out. I find I have entirely lost the habit of letting them go. And he led her into supper, and she went, leaning on his arm more than she needed to, and neither of them spoke of it further that night, but the thing had been said that could not be unsaid, and it lay between them at the fireside like a lit lamp, and outside the winter closed down black and cold over the moor. And somewhere south along the dark coast road, drawn by 4 horses and a grim old purpose, the dowager Lady Wraxall was already coming. Lady Wraxall came on the 3rd day, in the late afternoon, with the light already failing and a hard sleet beginning to slant in off the sea. And her travelling coach came up the moor road black and glistening, and stopped before the door of Rouseworthy with a great jangle and stamp, and she got down out of it before the steps were properly let. A tall spare woman in unrelieved grey, with a face like a closed account and eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. Dagobert met her in the hall. He had dressed for it. He had, for the first time in 3 years, put on the whole cold armour of who he was. The dark coat and the correct linen and the manner of a duke in his own house, because he had understood that Lady Wraxall would only respect what she could not intimidate, and he meant to give her nothing to intimidate. She swept in on a gust of sleet and stripped off her gloves and looked at him up and down, and her thin mouth pressed thinner. "So," she said, "you are alive after all. I had begun to doubt it. 3 years Rouseworthy and not one word to me, not one, and I your Cassandra's own blood, and the nearest thing to a mother you have left in the world, and now I hear of you at last. And how do I hear of you? I hear of you through the mouths of my own servants, who had it from the town, that the Duke of Rouseworthy has taken a drowned trollop into his house and is buying cradles for her bastard. That is how I hear that you are alive. You will forgive me if I did not wait to be invited." "You will not use that word in this house," said Dagobert. He said it quietly, and he did not raise his voice, and something in the quietness of it stopped even Lady Wraxall, who had not been stopped by anyone in 40 years. She looked at him more sharply. "Which word?" she said. "There are 2 that will not please you. I chose them with care. Either, both. You will not use them of her, nor of the child, under my roof or anywhere that I can hear you." Dagobert held her cold eye and did not blink. "The lady is Mrs. Jonquil Ingleby, the widow of Thomas Ingleby of Whitby, a respectable master's mate who died last spring. The child she carries is her late husband's lawful child, got in wedlock and left fatherless by an ordinary cruelty of the sea. She was wrecked on the Skerry in the great storm at Michaelmas, and I pulled her out of the water myself with these hands, the only living soul the sea gave back off a ship of 30, and I have sheltered her since as any Christian man with a roof would shelter a half-drowned widow near her time. And if the county chooses to make that into a scandal, then the county may be ashamed of itself. But I will not be ashamed, and neither, madam, while I stand, will she." There was a silence in the cold hall. Lady Wraxall studied him, and something moved behind the iron of her face, surprise first. That the shut, dead, grief-hollowed man she had expected to find should stand before her with a living force in him, she had not seen since before Cassandra died, and then, following it, a shrewd and narrowing suspicion, because Lady Wraxall had not survived 60 years in the world by mistaking the sound of a man defending a woman he loved for the sound of a man defending a mere act of charity. "You pulled her out of the water with your own hands," she repeated slowly. "You, who would not come out of this house to bury half your own tenants, nor answer a letter, nor let a friend pass the door. You went down a cliff in a storm for a stranger." She removed her bonnet and handed it, without looking, to the frozen footman. "Take me to her, Roseworthy. I have come a long cold way, and I will see this paragon for myself, and I will make my own judgment of her, and you may spare me the speeches, for I have buried 2 husbands and a niece, and I am not to be moved by a fine defiance. Take me to her." He took her. He would rather have taken her anywhere else, but Jonquil had asked him that morning in a voice that shook only a little, to be allowed to meet the old woman properly, sitting up and dressed, and not to be hidden away as though she were the shameful thing they said. And Dagobert had looked at the brave set of her chin and agreed, so he took Lady Wraxall to the parlour, where Jonquil sat by the fire in the best of the plain gowns Mrs. Pell had made over for her, her dark hair neatly dressed, her hands folded on the great swell of the child, her face pale but composed, and she rose with difficulty. But she rose, she would not be found sitting, and made the old woman as good a curtsy as her state allowed. "Lady Wraxall," she said, "you are welcome to Roseworthy. I know what I must look like to you, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But I will say one thing before you say yours, if you will permit me, and then you may say anything you like." Lady Wraxall's brows rose a fraction. "Say it." "I did not know he was a duke," said Jonquil, simply, and Dagobert saw the courage it cost her to say it plainly and admired her for it more than he had admired anything in his life. "Not until 3 days ago. I thought him only a lonely gentleman with a great grief and a rough manner and a kind heart under it, and I was glad of him as one lonely creature is glad of another, and I did him a great wrong without knowing it, 'cause a lonely gentleman may shelter a widow and no one think of it. But a duke may not, and I have brought talk on him and shame on your family's name, and I am sorrier for it than I can say. Whatever you have come to call me, you cannot call me anything I have not already called myself these 3 days, but I will not have you think I schemed for this. I did not know what he was. I only knew that he did not let go of my hand. The old woman stood very still and looked at her for a long moment, and the sleet ticked against the window, and Dagobert stood by the door with his heart in his throat and watched his aunt's hard face and could not tell what was in it. And then Jonquil made a small sound. It was low and quickly stifled, and she pressed her hand hard against her side and set her jaw, and Dagobert, who had watched a wife in her travail 3 years ago and would carry the knowledge of it to his grave, knew the sound before Jonquil herself had finished making it, and was across the room before either woman had spoken. "It is nothing," Jonquil said quickly, too quickly, her face gone whiter. "It is only I have had these this last day. Mrs. Pell says they are nothing, that they come before the true time, that it is the body making ready. It is nothing. It will pass." And then another came harder and doubled her, and her hand shot out and gripped Dagobert's arm with the same drowning strength he remembered from the shingle, and this time it did not pass, and the front of her plain gown was suddenly darkly wet, and Mrs. Pell, hurrying in at the sound, took one look and went the colour of ash. "Her waters," the old servant said. "The child is coming. It is early. It is 3 weeks early by my reckoning, and she is not strong." She caught Dagobert's eye and did not finish, but he heard the rest of it in the space where she stopped, because it was the same silence in which, 3 years ago, he had heard his own life end. Not strong. And no doctor within 12 miles of moor and sleet and failing light. For one instant the old grey wave rose up in Dagobert of Rousworthy and told him that it was happening again, that he was to stand in this house and watch the sea and the childbed take another woman he loved. That he had been a fool to let himself be dragged up out of the water only to drown again in exactly the same place, and Jonquil, gripping his arm, white and frightened, her whole body seized in the grip of the thing, looked up into his face and saw the terror rising in it, and even then, even in that, tried to comfort him. "Do not," she gasped. "Do not look so. I am not going to leave you with a scandal on your hands, Dagobert. I would not be so ungrateful," and tried to laugh, and could not, and cried out instead, and that broke the wave. That small ruined jest, offered up to him out of the middle of her own peril to spare him his fear, that did what nothing else could have done, and the terror in Dagobert went hard and cold and turned in an instant into the one thing it was good for, which was action. "Mrs. Pell," he said, and his voice came out level as slack water, the voice of a man who has decided that the sea will not have this one. "Take her to the blue room. It is warm and it is ready." "Bess," to the village girl white-faced in the doorway, "hot water, all the linen in the press, and the birthing things Mrs. Pell laid by. Go." He bent and lifted Jonquil bodily into his arms as he had lifted her off the shingle, and she was heavier now, heavy with the life that was fighting to come, and he carried her out and up the stair with her face pressed into his neck and her hand fisted in his coat. Not strong enough, the man's own words, you heard him. She breathed against his throat, between the pains, still trying, absurdly, bravely, to release him from the thing. Dagobert, if it goes badly, you must not let it undo all the good the sea did in throwing me up. You came back to life. Whatever happens in that room, you must stay. Be quiet," said Dagobert, gently, fiercely, laying her down in the warm firelit blue room where she had first come back to breathing weeks ago. He took her face in his 2 scarred hands and made her look at him. "Now you listen to me, Jonquil Ingleby, and you believe it as you believed me on the shingle, for it is the same promise and it is just as true. You are not going back into the water. Do you hear me? Not this water and not any. I did not carry you up the cliff to lose you at the top of it. You are going to bring this child, and you are going to do it here, warm and safe and not alone, and I am going to be in this house every moment of it. And when it is done there will be 3 of us where there were 2, and none of us going anywhere. That is how it will be. I have said it, and I am a very stubborn man, and I am, God help us both, a duke, and it is generally considered one of my few genuine accomplishments. Now do the work. Mrs. Pell knows it. I will be beyond that door, and I will not move from it, and if you cry out I will hear you, and you are not alone. You are not alone. Say it back to me." And Jonquil, gripping his wrists, drenched and shaking and gripped again by the tide of it, looked up into the hard, weathered, terrified, resolute face bent over her and said, in a broken thread of a voice, the thing he needed to hear as much as she did. "I am not alone." "You are not alone," said Dagobert, and Mrs. Pell put her firm old hand on his shoulder and turned him toward the door, because there was work now that no duke could do, and he went, and the door shut behind him. And Dagobert of Rousworthy took up his station in the cold corridor with his back against the wall and his eyes shut, and the whole long dark night of the winter closing down, and began, for the second time in his life and the first in 3 years, to pray. The night was very long. Dagobert did not leave the corridor. He had said he would not move from the door, and he did not. He stood, and then he sat on the cold floor with his back against the wall and his knees drawn up like a boy, and then he stood again, and the sleet turned to snow against the black windows, and the fire in the sconces burned low, and was fed and burned low again, and through the heavy oak of the door came the sounds of the oldest, and most ordinary and most terrible work in the world, Mrs. Pell's low, steady murmur, on and on, never faltering, Bess's quick feet, and Jonquil crying out and being quiet and crying out again, each cry going into Dagobert like a blade, because he could do nothing, nothing. He who could carry her up a cliff against the whole strength of the sea could do nothing at all against this, and could only stand outside a door in the dark and endure it. Somewhere in the small house a hand touched his arm, and he started violently, and it was Lady Wraxall. He had forgotten her entirely. She had not gone to bed. She stood in the corridor in her severe grey with a shawl about her shoulders and a candle in her hand, and her hard old face in the candlelight was not what had been in the hall. She looked at him, sitting on the floor of his own house like a servant, grey with dread, his fine coat rumpled and his careful armour all fallen away, and something in the closed account of her face had come open. "I sat outside such a door once," she said. It was not her carrying voice. It was quite low. "You're Cassandra's mother, my sister." She did not. She stopped. "It is a long time ago, but I have not forgotten how the corridor feels. Move over, Rousworthy." "I am too old to stand, and I will not have it said I sat down while you stood, and I certainly will not go to my bed. We will keep the watch together, you and I." And to his astonishment, the Dowager Lady Wraxall lowered herself onto the cold settle against the corridor wall, and set her candle beside her, and folded her hands and kept the watch, and after a while into the dark, without looking at him, she spoke again. She said she did not know what you were, she said, in the parlour, before it took her. She said it plainly, and she said it against her own interest, for a scheming woman would have played the injured innocent and never confessed the not knowing, because the not knowing is the only thing that clears you both. A schemer trades on your rank. She did not know your rank until 3 days since, and she is sorrier that you have one than glad of it. I have been 60 years learning to tell the true from the false in a woman's face, Rousworthy. It is nearly the only accomplishment a woman of my sort is permitted, and I tell you that girl in there was not lying. She was quiet a moment. "I came here to save you from an adventuress." "I find you have not been caught by an adventuress. I find you have been saved by a good woman, which is a thing I did not think this family had any luck left in the world to deserve." A cry came through the door, long and tearing, and both of them flinched, and Lady Wraxall's old hand found Dagobert's in the dark and gripped it hard. "Pray, boy," she said roughly. "Never mind that you have forgotten how. So had I. Pray anyway." He prayed. They both did, the hard old woman and the hard grim man, side by side on a cold settle in a snowbound house at the edge of the sea, through the last black hours of the night. And toward the very end, when the cries came so close together, and so terribly that Dagobert was on his feet with his hand on the latch and Lady Wraxall's grip on his arm, the only thing keeping him from bursting into a place he could do no good. Toward the very end there came one long cry that seemed to take everything Jonquil had left in her, and then a silence so complete that Dagobert's heart stopped in his chest, and into that silence, thin and furious and astonishing and alive, came the cry of a newborn child. Dagobert stood with his hand on the latch and did not move. He could not. The child's cry went up and up, outraged and vigorous, the most beautiful and most terrible sound he had ever heard, and behind it, faint, he heard Mrs. Pell's voice break into a kind of laughing sob. "There now, there. Oh, you fine loud thing, there." But he did not hear Jonquil. He could not hear Jonquil. And until he heard Jonquil the child's cry was only half a mercy and might yet be the whole of a grief, and he stood frozen with the sweat cold on him and waited. And Lady Wraxall's hand tightened to the bone on his arm. The door opened. Bess stood in it, tear-streaked and radiant, and behind her the warm firelit room, and Mrs. Pell straightening from the bed with a small wrapped bundle in her arms, and in the bed, propped and drenched and grey with exhaustion and utterly, unmistakably, gloriously alive, her eyes open and turned toward the door, was Jonquil. A girl, said Mrs. Pell, and her old voice cracked clean across. A daughter. Small and 3 weeks early, and with a pair of lungs on her that will carry to the town, and the mother torn and spent and weak as water. But living, sir. Both of them living. Both. Dagobert crossed the room. He did not know that he crossed it. He was outside the door, and then he was on his knees by the bed, and Jonquil's exhausted eyes found his face, and she tried to speak and could not, and only lifted one hand a few inches off the coverlet toward him, and he took it in both of his and bowed over it, and, for the first time since a wet spring 3 years gone, Dagobert of Rossworthy wept, not the silent shameful weeping of grief, but something else, something that shook him head to foot and that he made no attempt at all to hide. Kneeling at the bedside with her small hand pressed hard against his wet face. "You are here," Jonquil whispered. It was barely a sound. "You said you would be. You are here. Is she?" "Mrs. Pell says. Is she truly?" "She is perfect," said Dagobert thickly, though he had not yet so much as looked at the child, though he could not yet take his eyes from the living face of the mother. "She is loud, and she is furious, and she is perfect, and you did it, Jonquil. You did the whole of it. You did not go back in the water, you brought her through." And Mrs. Pell was there then, laying the small wrapped weight of the daughter in the crook of the mother's arm, and Jonquil looked down at the tiny, crumpled, red, furious face of her child. The child of the good gentleman the sea had taken in the spring, and she began, weakly, to laugh and cry at once, and Dagobert looked at last at the little thing, at the impossibly small fingers working free of the shawl, and the dark, wet feather of hair and the outraged, squalling mouth. And something in the very deepest foundation of him, some last shut door that even Jonquil's hand on the shingle had not reached, came quietly and completely open. He put out one great scarred finger, the finger of the hand that had dragged the mother out of the sea, and the newborn's tiny hand found it and closed round it with the same blind, total drowning strength her mother's had, gripping, holding, and would not let go. And Dagobert of Rossworthy, Duke of the cold cliffs and the sea-battered house and 3 years of chosen death, knelt at a firelit bedside in the snow-quiet dawn and let a nameless castaway's daughter hold him fast by one finger and understood that he had been claimed, that they had both of them, mother and child, reached up out of the water and taken hold of him and would not let him go, and that he did not, with every fibre of his living reawakened heart, want them ever to. "Well," said Lady Wraxall. She had come to the foot of the bed. She stood there in her grey, upright as ever, but her hard old eyes were wet, and she looked down at the mother and the child and the great weeping man on his knees with the baby's fist about his finger, and her thin mouth worked, and she mastered it, in the way of women bred to master everything. "Well," she said again, "it is a Rossworthy sort of entrance at least, loud and against all advice, and 3 weeks before anyone was ready. She will do." She reached down, this Arn dowager who had come to drive a nameless woman from the door, and with one finger she touched the newborn's dark wet head, very gently, the way one touches something one has decided to defend. "You will call me nothing so cold as Lady Wraxall when you are grown," she informed the squalling infant. "There has been a great want of children in this family, and a great want of sense, and I find I am too old and too tired to keep up a quarrel with the only remedy either complaint has been offered in a decade. Rossworthy." She turned to Dagobert, and her voice recovered something of its iron, but it was iron in his defence now, and he heard the difference. "Get up off the floor. A duke does not propose to a lady from his knees while she is grey as ashes and cannot lift her own head. It is unfair to her. She cannot run and she cannot answer sensibly. You will wait until she is strong. You will wait until she is well and fed and rested. And until this small person is thriving, and then you'll do the thing properly in daylight, with her free to say no to you if she is fool enough to want to. and if the county has one word to say about any of it, the county may say the word to me. I believe I still remember how to make the county sorry. She drew her shawl about her shoulders and turned for the door with the whole of her ancient dignity restored. I shall stay, she announced, to the room in general, until the christening. Somebody in this house must remember how a duke's daughter is properly brought into the world, and it is plainly going to have to be me. Mrs. Pell, I will want tea, and then I will want a bed, for I have sat up the whole night on a settle at my age, and it is entirely your master's fault, and he knows it. And she went out, upright and iron and weeping and entirely triumphant, and Mrs. Pell followed to see to the tea with her apron pressed to her eyes, and Dagobert did not get up off the floor. He stayed where he was at the bedside in the snow light of the new morning, with Jonquil's hand in one of his and the baby's fist about the finger of the other, joining the three of them, and he looked at the 2 lives the sea had given him after taking so much, and he did not say anything at all, because there was nothing that needed saying that was not already being said by his refusal to let go, and Jonquil, spent and safe and warm and no longer, ever again alone, looked back at him with her whole heart in her tired eyes, and neither of them let go. And outside the last of the snow came down soft and white over the cliffs and the quiet sea, and the long winter dark was over. The child throve, that was the first great fact of the new year, and it steadied everything else. She had come 3 weeks early and small enough to fit in the crook of one of Dagobert's forearms, but she fed and slept and roared and grew, and by the turning of the year her small furious face had softened into something that watched the firelight with grave dark eyes, and Jonquil, nursed with a fierce devotion by Mrs. Pell and superintended with an even fiercer one by Lady Wraxall, came slowly back into her strength. The colour returned to her. She left the blue room, and then she left the house, walking on Dagobert's arm along the cliff top in the hard bright January air with the child bundled to her breast, and she stood at the very place where he had stood the night of the wreck and looked down at the cove where a ship had died and she had not, and she did not weep. And Dagobert stood beside her and did not speak, and the sea, far below, came in and drew back and came in, quiet now, keeping its distance. The county, of course, did not keep its distance. The county came. It came in the persons of the neighbouring gentry, who had not been received at Roosworthy in 3 years, and who now, scenting scandal, discovered a sudden warm concern for the health of the poor bereaved duke, and they came with their curiosity dressed as courtesy and their cruelty dressed as concern. And chief among came Mrs. Golightly of Thorn Abbas, a plump, smiling, malicious woman with a genius for the wounding thing gently said, who arrived one afternoon in her carriage with 2 simpering daughters and every intention of seeing the notorious castaway humbled at the great man's expense. She had reckoned without Lady Wraxall, and she had reckoned far more disastrously without the Duke. They were shown into the great hall, which Dagobert had ordered opened and lit and warmed for the first time in 3 years, for he had decided that if the county would come, the county should come to a house in its full power and be met there, and not to a huddle of 2 warm rooms it could pity. Fires roared in the great grates. The Roseworthy plate was out, and at the head of the hall, in a chair that was very nearly a throne, sat Jonquil Ingleby in a gown of dove-grey silk that Lady Wraxall had sent to town for, with the child in her arms and the dowager on one side of her and the Duke of Roseworthy standing at her other hand with his fingers resting on the back of her chair, and the whole arrangement said, before a word was spoken, exactly what Dagobert meant it to say. Mrs. Golightly, undeterred, advanced smiling. "Your Grace," she cooed, "how it gladdens us all to see you come out of your sad seclusion at last. And what a very singular household you keep now. We had heard the most extraordinary things. A young person off a wreck, quite without connections, and—" Her bright eyes went to the child, and her smile sweetened to poison. "A little one already, and no husband to be seen. One hardly knows what to think. One tries so hard not to think anything unkind, but the world is such a censorious place, and a gentleman of your great position cannot be too careful of appearances, can he, for his own dear sake?" Dagobert did not raise his voice. He had learned that autumn that he did not need to. "You are quite right, Mrs. Golightly," he said pleasantly, "that a man in my position cannot be too careful of appearances. So allow me to correct the appearance you have travelled all this way to inspect. that you may carry the true one home and spare the world its labor of invention. He came round the chair and stood before her, and though he smiled, the whole hall went quiet. Because there was something in the Duke of Rusworthy fully alive and standing in defence of what he loved that made a room go quiet. This lady is Mrs. Jonquil Ingleby, the widow of Mr. Thomas Ingleby of Whitby, a good man who died in the spring and whom she mourns. This child is his lawful daughter, born under my roof because her mother was thrown up half dead on my shore out of a wreck that drowned 29 others, and taken in by me because I am, I hope, still a Christian, whatever the county has decided to think of me. So much for the facts. And now the appearance. He let the pause fall. The appearance, madam, is this. I mean to marry her. I have not yet asked her, for she has been too ill, and she may yet, when I do ask her, be wise enough to refuse a bad-tempered widower twice shut up alone on a cliff. But I mean to ask her. And if she will have me, she will be the Duchess of Rusworthy before the spring, and the child will be my daughter in every way the law, and my heart between them can contrive. And any man or woman in this county who cannot bring themselves to be civil to my wife and my daughter need never trouble to climb this hill again, for they will not be received. There is the appearance. Pray carry it home entire. I should be sorry to have you misquote a single word. The silence in the great hall was total. Mrs. Golightly's smile had frozen and slid and fallen off her face entirely. She looked once at the Dowager Lady Wraxall, who was a far greater personage than any Golightly and whose word could open or shut every door that mattered for 40 miles. And Lady Wraxall looked back at her with the pleasant, level, annihilating serenity of an old woman who has decided to enjoy herself, and said, "You may put me down, Amelia, as entirely of my nephew's mind, and you may say I said so, and you may say it wherever you please. I have known this family 50 years, and I tell you there has not been a bride to enter it more worthy of it than the one you have just been so unwise as to insult under her own roof. I should mend that if I were you, and quickly, before the story of this afternoon reaches town ahead of you. It would reach town so much more kindly told, would it not, if the Golightleys had been the very first to wish the match joy?" It was a threat and a rope thrown at once, and Mrs. Golightly, who was malicious but not a fool, caught the rope. Her smile came scrambling back, transformed. She turned to Jonquil and dropped, if not quite a curtsy, at least a considerable inclination of her plump self, and declared, in a voice gone suddenly warm as new milk, that she was sure she had never meant the smallest unkindness, that the story was the most affecting she had ever heard. That a widow so tried and so brave and so, she cast about, so evidently gentle would do the county nothing but honour, and that the Golightleys of Thorn Abbas would be proud, most proud, to be counted among the very first to call. And Jonquil, who through the whole of it had sat with the child in her arms and her chin high and her face composed, inclined her head with a grave courtesy that gave the woman not 1 inch more than she had earned, and said only, "You are very good, Mrs. Golightly. We shall be at home on Thursdays," and Lady Wraxall made a sound the less magnificent woman would have been a snort of laughter, and the visit, and with it the resistance of the entire county, was over. The tide had turned. Where the Golightleys called, all the rest would follow. Dagobert did not ask her that day, nor the next. He waited, as he had promised Lady Wraxall he would, until Jonquil was wholly well, until the last shadow of the wreck and the childbed had gone out of her face, and she walked the cliffs with a firm step and laughed. He had heard her laugh now, truly laugh, and he had decided it was the best sound the house had made in 100 years. He waited until a soft grey afternoon at the very end of winter, when the first green was coming on the moor and the child slept in the oak cradle by the parlour fire. And then he took Jonquil out along the cliff, the place above the cove, the place where he had stood the night the sea gave her to him, and he stopped there and turned to her and found that all his careful words had deserted him entirely. "I had a great deal I meant to say," he said at last, roughly. "I have been 3 days composing it. It is all gone. I can only say the plain thing, which is the true thing, and which I told you once already in the parlour when you would not let self hear it. I love you. I loved you, I think, from the moment on the shingle when you took hold of my coat and would not let go, though it took me weeks to know it, and I have loved you more every day since." And I have not been truly alive 1 hour of the 3 years before you, and I do not intend to waste any more of the hours I have left pretending I could do without you. Marry me, Jonquil. Let me be your husband and her father, not out of gratitude. I will not have you say yes out of gratitude. I could not bear it, and not because you have nowhere else, for you have somewhere else now. You have me whether you marry me or no. This house is yours and the child's for as long as you live, and that is settled and past changing. Marry me because you want the man who fetches you sea holly and cannot make his face behave, or do not and stay anyway, and break my heart gently over 40 years. But if there is any part of you that wants it, say so. I have been very brave about a great many things in my life. I find I have no courage at all left over for this. And Jonquil Ingleby stood on the cliff top above the sea that had taken everything from her, and then, in its one strange mercy, given her this. And she looked up at the hard, weathered, forbidding, treasured face of the silent man who had carried her up out of the water, and her eyes filled, and she did not, this time, look away, and she did not tell him it was impossible. You foolish, foolish, dear man, she said, and her voice shook and steadied, as though it were ever in doubt, as though I have not loved you since, I do not even know since when, since the broth perhaps, since the cradle. Since you told me I should not go back in the water, and then would not yourself let me. Yes, Dagobert, not out of gratitude, out of every other thing there is, yes. He drew her in, then at last, this man who had not held another living soul against his heart in 3 years. And she came into his arms on the cliff top with the sea quiet below them, and he held her as though she were the whole of the world newly returned to him, which she was, and she turned her face up to his. And there, above the cove where it had all begun, with the first green coming on the moor and their daughter sleeping warm by the fire in the house behind them, he kissed her, and the wind off the sea came up soft and clean and wrapped them round, and did not, this time, try for either of them. They were married in the spring, in the small grey church in the village, with Lady Wraxall in the first pew like an iron figurehead, and Mrs. Pell weeping to her best bonnet, and the whole county crowded in behind, having discovered, as one, that it had never had anything but the warmest feelings for the brave shipwrecked widow the Duke had raised up. The child was christened the same day, Cassandra, at Jonquil's own asking, for the wife who had gone before, and Dagobert had not been able to speak when she asked it, and had only taken her hand and pressed it hard, and Lady Wraxall had wept without any pretence of iron at all. And when the Duke of Roseworthy carried his daughter out of the church into the spring light with his wife on his arm, the bells rang out over the cliffs and the moor and the quiet sea, and the sound of them carried, as Mrs. Pell had promised the child's lungs would, all the way to the town. Roseworthy was never a silent house again. It filled with the child's noise first, and then, in the years that came, with more of it, with fires in every grate and doors thrown open and the county forever climbing the hill on Thursdays, with Lady Wraxall, who came for the christening and contrived, one way and another, never quite to leave, and who died at a great age in the Blue Room some years on, holding the hand of the woman she had come to drive from door and calling her, at the last, the best thing the family had ever had the luck to be given. And Dagobert grew old in that house beside his Jonquil, and never once, to the end of his long life, stood at the lip of the cliff to let the storm try for him again, because he had no more use for the noise of the sea. The noise inside his own chest had gone quiet on its own, and warm and full. But sometimes on wild nights, when the wind hauled at the house and the great Atlantic flung itself in and out of the cove below exactly as it had on the night the ship broke up on the Skerry, Dagobert would wake, and lie listening to the storm he had once better than living, and reach out in the dark, and Jonquil's hand would be there, and would close on his with the same sure strength it had first closed with on the drowning shingle, and would not let go. And he would lie in the warm dark of the full house with his wife's hand in his and their children sleeping down the corridor, and he would listen to the sea take what it took, out beyond the safe walls, and he would think, every time, with a gratitude that never wore thin in all the years he had it, the sea keeps what it takes, but once, only once, and against all its nature, it gave something back, and he had been standing on the cliff to catch her, and he had not let go, and he never did.